Between the very much hyped news about the recent bar passers in the Philippines and my current choice of book about Chanel Miller, I have started wondering about the safety of students, particularly female and femme-presenting students, at higher education institutions in the Philippines or in university towns in general. Sure, my expectations are low already because I do not think any country has fully worked out how to provide a safe space for their students on campuses around the world. Take these stats from the US, for example. According to the RAIN.org website, that is RAINN, 13% of all students experience rape or sexual assault through physical force, violence, or incapacitation on campus. Notice that I said all students and not just female or femme-presenting students. Amongst the undergrads, 26.4% of female and 6.8% of male students experience rape or sexual assault, whilst 5.8% of students have experienced stalking since entering university or college. According to RAIN, sexual violence is more prevalent at college or university than any other crime, meaning even more than theft, murder, or physical assault. How about these numbers from the UK? According to revoltsexualassault.com, 62% of all students and graduates have experienced sexual violence at UK universities, and that is not even counting the incidents that take place around those universities. Going back to the numbers, only 1 in 10 students have reported their experiences to university police, and only 2% of those felt both able to report it to them and were then satisfied with the reporting process. These numbers came from the organization's survey of 4,500 students from 153 different institutions. Of the female respondents, 70% have experienced sexual assault. Of the male respondents, 28% have experienced sexual assault. Let us quickly jump to Southeast Asia and look at numbers from Singapore. Unsurprisingly, the data out of Singapore is not as comprehensive as the 2 other countries, but here's what I found out. In May 2019, it was made public that there had been 56 cases of sexual misconduct involving students from 6 local universities in the 3 years leading to 2019. Bear in mind, these numbers only came to light when a faculty member was dismissed in the midst of the #MeToo movement. Once this dam broke open, reports of sexual violence started popping up more and more. You could find them on Twitter, various forums, Facebook, and all sorts of corners of social media. By 2020, institutes of higher learning handled a total of 172 cases of sexual misconduct between 2015 and 2020. These crimes were committed both by students and staff members, and this number will just keep getting bigger in Singapore. These were all on-campus incidents only. Which brings me to today's case. No case in the Philippines in the past has managed to shine such a glaring and garish light on physical and especially sexual violence on women on and around campus like this case. Whilst people have always known of gender-based violence taking place in higher education places or this being prevalent in university towns, the topic was never front and center, much to my dismay and the dismay of women's groups who have tried to put the spotlight on how unsafe such a supposedly safe space could be, especially for young women. And it would seem that the issue will only get worse if not addressed immediately and holistically. This is the case of Given Grace Cebanico. Mabuhay Lagim fam! Welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. This is episode 8 of season 4. If you're new here, welcome to the Lagim fam, and if you've been here since day 1, welcome back and thank you for stopping by again. If you want to know how to support me or follow me on social media, make sure to stay until the very end and to check out my show notes as well. Without further ado, let us get started with today's case. As always, details in this case might be triggering for some people. So please take care of yourselves whilst listening. The last time I covered a case that took place in Los Baños, it took me 2 episodes to cover it, and those 2 episodes were filled with very upsetting details. The case of Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez remains one of the most upsetting cases I've ever covered here, but that might just change after covering this current case. University students are, granted, a very different breed of people. They are somewhere between the real adult world and that carefree teenage life with less to no huge responsibilities. They are full of life, fresh ideas, rebelliousness. They can be refreshingly idealistic and sometimes out of touch, but almost in a good way. They remind me that I may have accepted the status quo too much, accepted the 9-to-5 life too much, and should strive to question the man more. When I talk to university students, I'm reminded of possibilities, that unapologetic belief in potential, and a better world. University students are either always busy or always sleeping, and there's no in between, and frankly, I love that for them. For Given Grace Cebanico, a 19-year-old from Binangonan, Rizal, it would seem that she fell into the first category as a junior at the University of Los Baños studying computer science. Grace lived at the 5th of September mansion in Omali subdivision, a dormitory on Diamond Street, conveniently close to her faculty building on Harold Kusner Royal Palm Avenue. On Monday, the 10th of October 2011, after attending all of her classes that day, Grace left her dorm room again at around 8 in the evening. She was headed to a classmate's dorm to work on a group project. After the group decided to call it a night, Grace started heading back home at around 3 in the morning. We would later learn that after this moment, no one would hear of or see Grace again. Brgy Putho-Tuntungin is a small village in Los Baños with around 10,000 residents. It is in fact so small that when you Google it, websites are still not sure if it is indeed called Brgy Putho-Tuntungin or Tuntungin Putho. Either versions are apparently well represented in my Google search at the very least. The barangay is located near the boundaries of UPLB's university campus, and so it is not unknown to the students in the area. On the 11th of October 2011, at approximately 7 in the morning, this small barangay suddenly became the center of Los Baños when residents of this unassuming place were shocked by a discovery in a canal on Apex Road. The battered body of a young woman was found by some residents, and this sent shockwaves all throughout the university town. The first local reports that emerged claimed that the body was found with hands tied or cuffed and with the person's mouth covered with tape. The same reports claimed also that the body was badly bruised, and worst of all, there was a gunshot wound to the head of this now deceased person. The police were alerted immediately, and the body was recovered and then taken to a funeral home in Bay, Laguna, where it remained for autopsy, identification, and further examination. National news outlets, as far as my research is concerned, had not yet gotten involved at this point, so the news of the badly beaten body from Brgy Putho-Tuntungin remained local news that had not really reached all 4 corners of the small university enclave. Meanwhile, in Binangonan, Rizal, Pastor Jun Cebanico was going about his normal day when he decided to open up his Facebook feed. What was normally an innocuous pre-work thing that the pastor indulged in from time to time suddenly became a very huge source of worry. He saw that college friends of his daughter's, Given Grace, were posting about her disappearance. It would seem that they were looking for her. As a parent, you may either jump to conclusions and panic or keep calm and see whether this was all just a huge misunderstanding. Pastor June went with the latter, but not for long. Sometime after seeing these posts, the pastor received a call from his niece, who reported that Grace had been missing since Monday night. She also filled him in on some of the local news about the still unidentified body that was found in Brgy Putho-Tuntungin. The pastor suddenly felt differently about the posts he had seen earlier on Facebook. Panic had started to set in. An hour later, the pastor and his wife Marlene received the most awful news that no parent should ever get. The body found in Brgy Putho-Tuntungin belonged to their only beloved daughter, Given Grace Cebanico. Their world shattered into a million pieces, but like in any loss of a loved one, their minds went into denial mode. We've either all seen this or gone through this ourselves. When we receive news of a deeply awful nature, we instinctively do not want to believe it. It is like our brains cannot handle this sudden and new reality, so we deny it. Pastor Jun Cebanico immediately asked his wife Marlene to call their daughter's phone, but alas, they were unsuccessful. It was at this point that the couple decided to make their way to Los Baños, and on their way there, they received another call. They were told to head to the UPLB campus where the police were waiting for them. They were to identify Grace's body. The couple was in anguish at this point. The firstborn was dead, and from the little that they know, it would seem that Grace died a gruesome death. No parent should have to go through this. Marlene was in hysterics, feeling like her head was going to break, and then the heavens opened. It rained heavily as the couple was nearing the UPLB campus, as if the heavens knew that an innocent life had been so cruelly claimed. Whilst a few knew of Grace's awful fate already to some extent or another, as I said, the national media did not seem to have caught on until around 2 days later. I am assuming that some of Grace's friends or classmates who were looking for her through social media may not have made the connection between the body found in Brgy Putho-Tuntungin and their friend's disappearance just yet, but by Thursday, the 13th of October, the mystery was over. For those who knew Grace and for the rest of us who were not aware of her existence before this tragedy, the circumstances of her death were deeply shocking. It could not have been easy for the Cebanicos to hear these details 2 days before the whole nation became privy to the tragedy that had befallen their family. The police would go on to explain to the media that apart from Grace's badly bruised body and the gunshot wound to her head, it would seem that perhaps Grace had also been sexually assaulted, as she was found without her underwear. Pending the final autopsy results, the police could of course neither confirm nor deny this. Chief Inspector Andres Simbahon Jr., spokesperson for the Calabarzon Police, also added that Grace was stabbed in the back, that before her mouth was covered with tape, she was actually gagged with a handkerchief. When these reports came out, the public's response was swift and demanding. The safety of university students, especially female ones, in the Los Baños community was questioned, and the PNP immediately felt the pressure of having to produce suspects, to show arrests, and to bring the case to a quick end. And it would seem that they just might, a mere day after the first reports about Grace's murder came out. On the 14th of October, the police reported that a witness had come forward the day before to identify at least one suspect. The police would later explain to the media that after having recovered Grace's body on the 11th of October, they received a phone call from a barangay official on the 12th of October. The barangay official explained that an adult man was threatening a 16-year-old teenage boy. On its own, this would not have piqued the interest of the police. Why should they care about this teenager when they have quite literally a murder on their hands? But then the barangay official explained that the boy mentioned that this person who threatened him claimed to have been involved in Grace's murder. Now, this changed things a little bit. The police then proceeded to pick up the 16-year-old boy and interview him, and what they learned blew the case wide open. According to the witness, who to this day remains unnamed in reports, he was tagging along two men and was told that the three of them would be looking for someone to rob. They were all in a tricycle that was being driven by one of the grown-ups, and the teen seemed uncomfortable about the idea of robbing someone. He was very young after all, but because he was young, he also felt compelled to just roll with the idea, and so he and the two other men prowled the streets of Los Baños at dawn. And then they spotted someone. It was Grace. According to the teenager, when the men decided that she was going to be their victim that night, they pulled up beside her, threatened her with a gun, and forced her into the tricycle. At this point, the teenage boy felt like this was getting way more serious than what he bargained for. And so he ran away, leaving a scared Grace Cebanico at the mercy of the two men. The teenage boy, who had now become the police's first and perhaps most important witness, identified one of the two grown men as Percival de Guzman, a 38-year-old tricycle driver. The police did not waste time in looking for the two men, and pretty much on the same day that we learned about Grace's fate, Percival de Guzman was arrested after drawing attention to himself by being drunk and belligerent at a billiard hall in Barangay Batong Malaki. The police stated to the media that they were looking at robbery as the main and original motive for Grace's murder, as she was missing her mobile phone, laptop, and wallet when she was found. However, with the brutality with which Grace was murdered and the fact that she was missing her underwear, the police needed to further look into de Guzman and the other person of interest, because it was possible that the robbery was just incidental and not the main and intended crime at all. Now, having arrived at the police station following his arrest, de Guzman was positively identified by the teenage boy. Upon doing their routine search of their suspect, the police also found on de Guzman an iPhone, which was then identified as Grace's phone after the police switched it on and found Grace's picture on the screen. They also found an iPod player that, as it turned out, belonged to Grace as well. The police were not initially aware that this was missing, but it was important that this was added to the list of things de Guzman and the other still unidentified man stole from Grace. Now, proceeding with their usual first interview of their suspect, de Guzman, without missing a beat, tried to point fingers at someone else, the said unidentified man, only this time, he's got a name. The second suspect in the Grace Cebanico murder was identified as Lester Ivan Lopez Rivera. This was the first time that the police had ever heard the name of the second person that the teenager had implicated in his story earlier. De Guzman insisted that the police should be looking at Rivera as he was the mastermind of what happened to Grace. Rivera at that time was a security guard for PS Bank. The police immediately thought of Grace's gunshot wound, which now made sense that a security guard with access to a service firearm could potentially be involved. And so the hunt for Rivera intensified, and it was important he'd be found ASAP, because the assumption back then was that he was still very much armed and dangerous. A reward was also offered by the local police, encouraging the public to help them solve the case in return for 25,000 pesos. But then things took a rather different turn. Shortly after it became known in the media that Rivera had been implicated and that a manhunt was being conducted to find the security guard, somewhere in Floridablanca, Pampanga, Lester Ivan Lopez Rivera walked into a local police station and surrendered himself. According to Senior Superintendent Edgardo Tino, Pampanga's police director back then, Rivera had sought refuge at his grandfather's home in Barangay Palmayo in Floridablanca, Pampanga, after news of Grace's body being recovered had started spreading all over Los Baños. However, Rivera's grandfather was having none of this. Upon learning about what his grandson could be involved with, he reported him to the Palmayo barangay chief, who in turn informed the local police station. He also told the police that although his grandson admitted to using his .38 caliber service gun to shoot Grace, he denied any allegations of rape. After this, Rivera went to the police station to give himself up, after which he was transported back to Los Baños for further questioning. And this was where the finger pointing started between the two suspects, as they both insisted that they were just following the other's lead in taking the life of young Given Grace Cebanico. The way this case developed in 2011 was really quick, and the police had a pretty solid idea of how things went down in the early morning hours of October 11th. They just needed some more information from Grace's autopsy, which would give them a better understanding and a clearer picture of how things unfolded that night, especially because I think they were not believing everything the two suspects were telling them. After all, they were at this point just blaming each other and trying to make themselves look better, in a case where they have all but admitted to killing a 19-year-old student. In the meantime, the UPLB Vice Chancellor for Community Affairs, Virginia Cardenas, was quoted saying in an interview that Grace was not raped. Now, I am highlighting this because something about this statement irked me. What did she know that we did not know at this point? The police had not really said anything about the rape because the results of the autopsy were not made public yet. Cardenas either knew something before we all did, or she was trying to damage control without anything to back up her claim because she was perhaps getting pressure from her own employers and the parents of students, especially female students. I feel like Cardenas had completely missed the point here. A potential rape was bad, yes, of course, but did she actually forget that someone was quite literally murdered near campus? The public statement was misguided and unnecessary. And I think Cardenas's face may have turned very white shortly after releasing this statement because by the 14th of October, initial autopsy reports showed that Grace was in fact raped, and further investigation by the police showed that both suspects raped Grace and not just Rivera. This was devastating news on top of devastating news for Grace's family, of course. The police then released more information on the same day, and these were details that I think they were able to gather from their interrogation of both suspects. So, as we know, Grace was a victim of opportunity. It could have been anyone else, but Grace was the unfortunate one who was spotted by the two suspects who were hell-bent on robbing someone that night. Grace, unfortunately, was at the wrong place at the wrong time. After having forced her into the tricycle, as I mentioned before already, it would seem that not only was Grace robbed of her possessions, but the two men also took turns in raping her. De Guzman would also later admit that Rivera had boasted about having killed 7 people before, which made the police look into the possibility of a serial killing. No update had been published about this particular aspect of the case, so I am assuming that Rivera was merely boasting and was just full of hot air. At that time, however, the police did admit that with how the suspects committed their heinous crime in Grace's case, there was a suspicion that both De Guzman and Rivera were not first-timers and that they had worked together before in robbing people in the community. This was further strengthened by the fact that Rivera actually had a criminal record at the time of Grace's murder. The police shared that when they were questioning Rivera's family and friends as well, they were taken aback by the family's reaction. When questioned about Rivera, his family members immediately asked, "Saan na naman nagnakaw?" where did he go robbing again? Referring to Rivera. As it turned out, it was an open secret in the community that Rivera had committed robbery before, and somehow, with his criminal record and his reputation, he was still hired to become a security guard at a local rural bank, a guard with access to a firearm. It became clear to the police that the bank, or the agency that Rivera belonged to, either never checked his background or maybe checked it and did not give a damn about his criminal records. Either way, it looked bad for the bank and or the agency, but that is a whole separate discussion. For now, let us go back to Grace's case. By Friday, the 14th of October, both De Guzman and Rivera were charged. The charge was rape with homicide, which did not sit well with a lot of people like Laguna Governor George Ejercito, who wanted to see a charge of rape with murder and robbery. This carries a heavier sentence but would also need a lot of work to prove by the prosecution. I kind of agree that maybe it would have been better to start with a higher charge and let the judge in this case decide after the trial or trials whether the burden of proof for rape with murder and robbery was met. By lowballing the charge, so to speak, and in my opinion, I think the PNP may have done Grace a disservice, but I am only a layperson commenting on the intricacies of Filipino police processes, so at this point, I digress. On the same day that the charges were laid against the two suspects, Rivera attempted to escape from where he was being held by the police, but that attempt was quickly foiled. That same evening, inquest proceedings started, getting the ball rolling on getting justice for Grace. Meanwhile, UPLB students and staff held a rally in Grace's honor, but also as a way to demand better measures from the university to keep its students safe. Now, if you did not know about this already, because I certainly did not before this episode, but UPLB is a bit of an open campus where a minority of students live on campus, but most students do not, meaning they need to get accommodation outside and use services and facilities that the greater Los Baños community has to offer. Now, many see this as perhaps increasing the students' interaction with non-students and therefore also increasing the risk of crimes being committed against the students. In my opinion, this is rather myopic because violence against students can also come from within, and creating an us versus them situation within a place like Los Baños does little in terms of keeping everyone safe. I understand that UPLB is now offering more on-campus dorms, and sure, this could help with some of the safety problems that they're having, but this solution is certainly not the end-all, be-all of this issue, but more to that later in this episode. On the 18th of October, Given Grace Cebanico was finally laid to rest 7 days after she was recovered from Brgy Putho-Tuntungin. Around 6,000 mourners attended her funeral in Binangonan, Rizal, with most of them wearing white and lavender, Grace's favorite colors. It was a sad day, but it was a particularly devastating day for Grace's parents who had to bury their firstborn. You see, Grace was beloved by many, especially by her family. She was the family's ate, after all, the big sister, who promised to graduate on time. She promised to find work right away and to help her parents send her younger brother to school as well. If one perused her Facebook page back then, they would see images of a mild, beautiful, and happy young woman. So when news of her awful murder came to light, it paralyzed a community. And you would think that UPLB and the local government would have started implementing immediate, real, and effective measures to keep the student population and the whole town safe. But between the months of October 2011 and March 2012, I could not really find much online as to what those two local authorities had done to prevent a repeat of what happened to Grace. I would have thought that Grace's death was perhaps a watershed moment, a moment that would help create some changes in the community, but I was wrong. Now, I mentioned March 2012 because this proved to be yet another inflection point in this issue of keeping UPLB students and the whole community safe. By March 2012, 3 more lives were claimed by criminals who had made this university community and the surrounding residents unsafe. In February 2012, a 14-year-old Sampaguita vendor and high school student named Rochelle Heronda was murdered and possibly raped on a banana plantation in Los Baños. A few days later, Ray Bernard Peñaranda, a third-year UPLB agriculture student, was also killed in a robbery attack. He was stabbed to death. A few hours later, a 32-year-old male was also murdered. In March 2012, Peter Cruz, first-year art student at the UP Open University in Los Baños, sustained stab wounds in his hands, arms, and stomach after 2 robbers attacked him in his own apartment. He survived, but just about. Much later, in November 2012, a 19-year-old agriculture student from UPLB by the name of Maria Victoria Reyes was found dead in her bedroom. She was also stabbed to death. Now, going back to March 2012, the best the Los Baños Council could come up with was a plan to impose a curfew. This proposal was met with jeers at a rally. Meanwhile, the local police authorities blamed a police shortage for the spate of killings in Los Baños and then sacked its police chief and 50 other police officials who were connected to the case. This was their best version of taking accountability, and I am honestly not surprised that the exhausted and anxious community was not having any of these band-aid solutions and spineless gestures. There needed to be more to keep the community safe. Now, from the sidelines of this mess, Grace's family was quietly observing what was going on in Los Baños, and they were also patiently waiting for a verdict in their daughter's case. And it would take the courts until 2016 to finally serve justice. In April 2016, Judge Alberto Serrano of the Regional Trial Court 92 in Calamba, Laguna, found Lester Ivan Lopez Rivera guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and sentenced him to 3 life imprisonment terms. Not long after this verdict, the same judge found Percival de Guzman guilty of rape with homicide and theft. He was sentenced to 3 life imprisonment terms for the rape with homicide and 12 to 17 years for theft. Rivera's former security agency had also filed a separate case against him for using his service firearm in a crime, but I have no further information about that case. The Cebanicos were relieved to learn of the verdicts and were grateful to all the people who stood by them all these years whilst waiting for justice to be served. In a heartbreaking interview, Pastor June recalled how he and his lawyer attended all of the hearings, which meant that he saw the monsters who took his daughter from him every single day. In this interview, he also recalled that in a surprising twist in February 2016, at Rivera's very last hearing, Rivera changed his plea from not guilty to guilty because, as he said, he was moved by his conscience. He also asked the Cebanicoses for forgiveness, saying, "Pastor, patawarin mo ako. Please forgive me, Pastor." Pastor June recalled how Rivera hugged him, and being the pastor that he is, he shared the following message to the very man who took the life of his firstborn child. "Alam mo, napakasakit ng ginawa mo sa amin, pero gusto ko ipaalam sa iyo na pinatawad ka namin at pinatatawad ka namin. Kung ang ginawa niyo sa anak ko ay maging paraan ni Lord para makilala mo siya, masakit sa amin pero masaya na rin kami. At least naging instrument ang anak ko para makilala mo si Lord. magkaroon ka ng relationship sa kanya. You know, what you did to us was extremely hurtful, but I want you to know that we have forgiven you. We forgive you. If what you did to my child had eventually led you to this path of getting to know the Lord, even though this whole thing is painful for us, then we can be happy. She was an instrument so you can get to know the Lord and can have a relationship with Him. This was extremely noble of Grace's father. I do not think a lot of people could have been this forgiving, and honestly, I would not hold it against those people either. Losing one's child is hard enough, but losing them in such a brutal manner is a trauma that will sit deep for the rest of a parent's life. But the Cebanicos were and are determined to transform such an ugly moment in their life to something beautiful. Pastor June and Mom Marlene had said in the past that Grace had a giving heart. To further honor their generous daughter, they created a foundation that offers scholarships to poor college students. According to them, this made sense and felt right, especially because Grace herself was a DOST, or Department of Science and Technology scholar in UPLB. The foundation is called the Given Grace Academic Excellence Foundation. I have included a link to their Facebook page in the show notes. Grace's case, whether a watershed moment or not, did end up influencing the way safety was and is being handled in the Los Baños community. UPLB committed to strengthening their security measures by installing additional CCTV monitors in strategic areas and by increasing security personnel visibility. Given all the killings and assaults that took place in 2012, it was high time that the local authorities in Los Baños and UPLB itself took matters seriously. Having said that, though, 2 years later, almost on the same day and almost at the same spot where Grace's body was found, a 17-year-old female UPLB student was taken and raped by a tricycle driver who threatened her with a weapon. Bear in mind, this was 2 years before the verdicts were handed down for De Guzman and Rivera. A barangay chief commented that after Grace's death, lamp posts were immediately put up along the road near where Grace met her end. But in the months leading up to the rape of the 17-year-old student 2 years later, these lamp posts had gone dark. This to me shows a lack of care and negligence, a complete disregard of such an important life and death issue. Still, the local authorities and the university promised increased patrolling. Later on, UPLB confirmed that they had started offering a late-night service to help students get home to their dorms and apartments after 10 p.m. They also confirmed that the university police force is now made up of real policemen who are college grads and board passers, which left me really bothered because who were they hiring before 2011 then? Just about anybody? Again, this shows a lack of care somehow and a disregard of such an important issue involving the lives and well-being of so many young people. The university also confirmed the existence of a fencing project around campus, which includes gates leading to the different communities around UPLB. They also confirmed that ID checks are being implemented more strictly, and as I said earlier, more on-campus dorms and services plus amenities like internet routers, washing machines are being made available, which will hopefully provide fewer reasons for students to venture out into places off campus. This is Grace's legacy. It will take time to get it right. UPLB's reputation has taken a hit, but maybe it had to for things to be taken seriously. But this is Grace's legacy. Her death will mean that others will get to be safer. My only hope is that on the way to this community becoming safer and getting things right, no casualty will be necessary anymore. Too many lives are destroyed when a young person dies, and no family should ever have to go through such a bitter tragedy just to see things change for the better. Lagim fam, thank you so much for listening to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you did, make sure to rate and review my podcast on Apple Podcasts and also Spotify because it helps with making my podcast more visible to those who do not know about it yet. Make sure to follow me on social media as well. I am mainly on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod. Find me on Facebook by simply typing in Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. And occasionally you can find me post some things on TikTok as well at Lagim Podcast. All the links to my socials are in the show notes, so make sure to check those out. Again, thank you Lagim fam for listening. Until next episode, maraming salamat at mabuhay.